Hi, my name is Dr. Jerrod Yarosh, and I'll be talking about environmental sociology, what we do and sort of how we study it. And so just a little bit of background about me. A PhD from Oklahoma State University in sociology, where I focus on environmental sociology and social psychology. But master's in sociology from Kent State University in Ohio, as well as a BA in philosophy from that institution. And so for me, generally, environmental sociology is just how humans and people interact and respond to their environment around them, especially focusing on what we think is sort of the natural environment and what we do and how we use it. And so that's what we'll sort of get into today and talk about briefly. So let me minimize myself down here and we'll go to our next slide. So what do we study? Well, it's sort of in general just the study of human environmental relationships. And so in this case, you can see that in this picture that there's a person. It looks like a stepped field or terraced where they're growing some crop. And so from an environmental sociologist perspective, what are humans using the environment for? Is it cropland? Is it to raise animals? Is it to build houses or other structures? Is it to mine the ore? What is going on? And so in a broad sense, that's what we're studying. We're trying to understand how humans and the environment coexist, work together, or even work against each other. And so this is just one case of that sort of occurring. Another way to think about it is as the relationship or about examining the relationship between society and nature. And so it's just not sort of looking and trying to just see it and report back. It's also trying to understand why or for what end. And so in this case, the road could be the Blue Ridge Parkway through the Carolinas. And so why did human society build it? Well, maybe it's to access something, so it's easy to go through there. Maybe it's to get to the natural environment or something else. And so as an environmental sociologist, we'd want to talk to the people that were involved in creating this, who live up here, who might experience it, who might travel on it, and see the sort of who, what, why, where, and when of the Blue Ridge Parkway to understand the relationship. And then we can even go out and look at how nature is being sort of overtaken, or maybe nature is coming back and overtaking it as well. And so just basically, right, what people do and why they do it with regards to nature or the natural environment, bettering it, trying to deal with the issues, or using it for their own gain, profit, whatever it might be. And so we also sometimes forget that in academia, we focus on things that sort of seem like problems or issues. But it's also about, for environmental sociologists, about where we live, work, and play, in the sense that there's plenty of research that focuses on what you do in the natural environment that sort of is beneficial to you as a human being. And so where you play, if you go out and hike and enjoy the mountains or the coast or whatever it might be, we want to know, why do you go to the coast versus somewhere else? Are you more ecologically conscious because of that or not? And so it's just not, pollution, or mining or whatever. It's about all these other aspects of our life too. And so in the case of work, Founders Hall is a good example of what an environmental sociologist might be interested in the sense that it's LEED certified, I think silver. That means it's fairly ecologically friendly, or energy conserves energy very well. As you have been there for a while and no one's walked down the hall, you'll see the lights turn out. That's one of those saving energy measures that they have implemented to get that status. And so we could understand, or try to understand, why was that building built that way? Why are other buildings built that way? Why are there other classifications from bronze to gold and what have you? So it's about where we work as well. And then lastly, sort of where we live. Do you use compact fluorescent light bulbs or LEDs? Do you carry a tote bag? Do you try to bike to work? Or do you have a garden in your backyard where you raise your produce, or whatever it might be? So we're trying to study all aspects of the environment, be it, very small scale micro to large scale macro, from the local to the global. It's just not sort of individual actions. It's, societal actions even, and group actions. And so it's also about the impacts that we have on the natural environment through our actions, which I sort of alluded to. But it's the idea that what we do, say in this case, a light bulb, it might not be very environmentally friendly. It uses a lot of energy, doesn't put out a lot of light. You could also get an LED light bulb that puts out a lot of light and uses much less energy. But depending on how people have talked about in the media, depending on what you have seen, in other words, how it's been framed and constructed, you might see and feel that LEDs are bad for a whole host of reasons. Some may be very accurate and true, others may not be. Same thing with, say, a carbon filament light bulb like this one, or an incandescent. We want to understand how people view the world, the natural world. And part of that is from the media that they consume and the information that they have, and even the personal experiences. And so, we survey people, we interview them, we do focus groups, we do experiments, we do ethnographies, anything and everything sociologists sort of do, especially environmental sociologists, because we can look at all these different ideas and relationships about the environment. And we'll get into a little bit more detail in specifics in the next few slides when I talk actually about actual research studies. And so sort of the last one before we move on, it's also about attitudes, values, and beliefs, which I sort of alluded to on that last slide. It's the idea that we all have our thoughts about, say, renewable energy. And so some people might say, this is great, sounds great, looks great, does a lot of good. There's others, though, that these interrupt migration patterns of birds and bats and other animals. And so these actually cause issues. Different attitudes. Maybe what you value. Do you value clean energy, or do you value animals or a nice view across the horizon? In the case of Florida, there's always been some want to have windmills out to sea. However, lots of people go to Florida for the views on the beaches and take pictures, and they don't want windmills in the background, even though that's where it's quite windy. And so what you value, what you believe, might impact what you do or what happens in our society in regards to the environment. And so we just don't study, sort of broad things. We study very specific things to people compared to their wants, for their wants and their attitudes, values, and beliefs. And so we all have competing views and understandings, and that's a big part of environmental sociology. It's trying to understand, where do you get these attitudes, values, and beliefs? Do you act on them, or how do you act on your attitudes, values, and beliefs? And then what are the consequences or outcomes for the environment, positive, negative, or neutral? And so lastly is the idea that, people try to deal with them. We try to understand what people do when they face an environmental issue. In this case, we could say climate change or global warming, could even be pollution or something like that. We're just not interested in sort of what people are doing. We're also interested in what people are doing to affect change or bring about change. And so people can protest. People can, sign a petition, write to their congressperson, or they can make individual changes. And so part of what I'm interested in is sort of green actions, for lack of a better way to say it, or ecologically friendly behavior. And so why do people protest versus using a tote bag? Or why do somebody use a LED light bulb rather than driving a Prius or a fuel efficient car, or whatever it might be? Obviously, there's different costs, there's different resources that are necessary, there's time commitments, and all that can be looked at and studied as well. And so we can use many different research methods to get at that understanding. And so this is just a very brief sort of overview of everything that we study, and there's much more as well, which we'll get to. And so for our first research sort of study focuses on content analysis or analyses. And so sort of a classic work by Boykoff and Boykoff wanted to understand how climate change or global warming, as you can see in this picture, was represented in the sort of popular press, and they studied magazines within the United States. And so what they did was that they gathered a number of papers throughout the nation, and they went and looked for every article, editorial, whatever it might be, that talked about climate change for over a period of time. And they looked for common themes to see if how it was represented. Was it said as or represented as global warming, climate change, human caused, non-human caused? And what they sort of found out overall is that the United States newspaper press gave a 50-50 split between those who believe it's sort of natural and just occurring, or it's really not, human caused or impacted, to those who see it as human caused or anthropogenic climate change. And on the outset, it doesn't sound like such an issue, a 50-50 split between how it's represented in the newspaper. And you're like, well, that's great. We get both views, right? Both views should be represented. And so they found this sort of journalistic norm where that was the case, that both views were represented. The issue, at least how they contend and present it, is that if you present something as 50-50, it would then sort of preclude that there's a scientific 50-50 split as well. However, if you look at the research or find an article about sort of climate change, you will see, or hopefully they might talk about sort of the overall representation of the scientific community, which is about 97% believe climate change is occurring. It's usually largely due to human issues like industrialization, driving of cars, mass manufacturing, stuff like that. And only 3% of the studies, research studies, find that, or scientists find that there's maybe not that human element. It's not really occurring, or however you sort of want to think about it in that way. And so if you represent something as 50-50 when it's really 97-3, we get a very different understanding from the scientific community. And so they were contending that this becomes an issue when we think, well, it's up for debate. It's not really settled. However, the scientific community, the meteorologists and climate researchers sort of have settled it. And because it's represented as not settled, maybe there's less actions. Maybe there aren't people protesting as much or aren't taking it as seriously. And thus we end up having a world where it's getting warmer and warmer. And because of that, there's an issue. So content analysis, looking for those common themes and coding words to be like, this represents anthropogenic climate change. This represents up for debate. And they went line by line, highlighting, or however they sort of did it in 2004 to understand that. And that's one way to do it. They also went on to do a study in Europe and saw that the United Kingdom had their newspapers represented about 80-20 or 90-10. It was closer to the scientific community representation of climate change, and it wasn't a 50-50 split. So even location matters. And so we do a lot of international work where we're looking how different places contend or talk about environmental issues or ideas, and then compare to see maybe there's different policies, there's different outcomes than what we have necessarily. So that's just one. Our second one is about food deserts, which we can call field research or sort of a natural experiment, or just going out into the world and understanding. And so a food desert is literally like a location like this, where not literally a desert, but it's a location where there are not grocery stores or access to food sort of in any case. There are some places that maybe just have fast food, like up here, which we would call food swamps, where there is food, but it's not sort of quality or nutritious, or not nearly as nutritious as veggies and stuff like that. More processed and prepackaged stuff, say convenience stores, rather than fresh vegetables and fruit and sort of having homemade food. And so for food desert researchers, you could actually go out and, sort of take note of how many there are. And so you could use GIS software or even Google Maps and look, and you could sort of make note that this community has X amount of fast food places versus, no grocery stores or whatever it might be. And so we, get out into the real world and get sort of our hands dirty, in other words, and see what's actually there. And so Walker, Keene, and Burke just give a good overview of sort of the food desert research in 2010, and I'll show you that reference later. But the idea is that we can study many different things. It's just not climate change, which is very global, while food deserts is very local, where some communities here at USCL, we look across the street from Founders Hall and we have a Chick-fil-A, Taco Bell down the street, and we have the Walmart right there, but kind of lacking in other options. Communities are like that too. I had a professor in my undergrad and master's program who was out in San Diego at the time, and he noticed that there weren't any places to get or access a grocery store easily in this one community, and they didn't even have any bus stops. So somebody that lived there either had to rely on a car and to drive really far to get to a place. However, the community didn't have a lot of residents that had cars because it was in a city, so they had to walk to a kind of faraway bus stop to get any access to a grocery store. They had some convenience stores and a gas station or two. So some of the kids were eating sort of their 3 meals from a gas station every day. And so he was concerned about obesity and sort of the lack of healthy food. So he started an organization that actually got a bus stop put in so the individuals that didn't have a car could get on the bus and get to a grocery store. And then eventually the organization bought a city block and actually got a grocery store put in. And so that community that was a food desert or swamp actually then had access to it. And so we, at least from my perspective as sociologists, would sometimes take a advocacy or sort of activist approach in trying to actually implement our findings and trying to sort of make the world better as we see it, just as an example in his case. And so we also do classic surveys. And so in this case, I have ethical consumerism there, or you can think of sort of green consumerism or green sort of political behavior, where what you do while you shop is seen as either pro-environmental or not. And in this case, ethical consumerism is sort of the idea of using environmentally friendly products or buying them versus not. And so in this case, single-use sort of plastic bag versus a reusable tote bag. This will last a long time. This might only last the trip to the car, or maybe not even that much if it's too full. And so what do people do and why do they do it in regards to the environment and their individual behaviors? A survey is a great way to get that information by asking, how often do you go to the grocery store? How often do you bring your reusable tote bag? How often do you use it? Do you buy LED light bulbs? All these other things in their sort of behaviors or thoughts about green products. And so why it's sort of called ethical consumerism, or sort of, green behavior or green consumption, is the idea that your actions are making an impact on the environment. And so you're sort of voting with your dollar. So the more green products that are sold, more environmentally products that are bought or sold, provides you or the environment with a better life, right? Because it's helping things out. In the work of Andrew Saz, he wrote a book called Shopping Your Way to Safety, which essentially is the idea that he contends that some people might use their tote bag because it betters the environment, but it's really for their own benefit, because they don't want the plastic, or they buy organic because they can afford it and they think it's good for them. They don't necessarily care about the larger security of the environment or other people. And so for him, he sort of argues that this ethical consumerism doesn't really help the environment, because if you're only sort of doing it for yourself, you're not taking it that next step and trying to do it sort of for everybody else. And so there's contention on whether or not that's actually sort of the case. But my sort of research focuses on that, and what I found is that, if you're environmentally conscious and you care about, using a tote bag, you probably do other environmentally conscious things that help out everybody, and not only them. But it's up for some debate, um, depending on who you're looking at, what types of behaviors you're asking or thinking about. And so, sort of lastly, we have interviews, right? Talking to people, asking them questions. And so in this area, we have environmental justice or injustice. And it's really the idea that some people in our world, in our societies, experience some not so great environments, from factories, from landfills, from things we call LULUs, or locally undesirable land uses, where the land might be cheap, housing is low cost, but there's this smog, there's this pollution. And so this sort of area of research is about trying to understand who's affected, why they're affected, and how they are affected. And so interviews, talking to the people, well, why do you live here? How does this affect you? What have you done to try to, change laws or whatever, gives us an understanding of, well, maybe people live here because it's cheap. Maybe they can only get a job that pays only so much, and so it's sort of a matter of economics. Um, there's other work that shows that these Lulus might be placed in communities for various reasons, from low income, cost of land, to actually sort of putting them in places where they know people will not have time or the ability or resources to resist and sort of protest and fight it. And so it might be in communities that are predominantly of people of color, or immigrants. And so there's lots of debate and trying to understand what and why, somebody lives here versus somebody that lives here. And so environmental justice is trying to understand and try to figure out and try to sort of equally distribute the environmental bads to everybody, or at least make it fair and just, and it shouldn't be sort of racist or classist in where they are put. But people here might be able to afford a day off of work to protest or write their legislature to get a law changed or passed, so the factory doesn't or isn't placed by them, and vice versa. And so Dr. Robert Bullard, who has a book that I'll show you in a minute, studied landfills in the southeastern part of the United States, and it was called Dumping in Dixie, which is right here, as you can see. And it's trying to understand that idea as well. And so Schlossberg just offers a sort of an overview of it as well too. And so, in summary, environmental sociology covers a lot of stuff. Trying to understand why people, use the mountains and go out to the nature. We also try to understand, the need for changes in our society, like mass transit versus roads versus high-speed bullet trains to buses, bike paths, whatever. Also understand, people's pets and what they do. Where do they live? What actions do they take that are environmentally friendly or not? And why do they see it that way? Their values, attitudes, and beliefs, and so much more. And so here are some readings and references. And so Stuart Lockey provides sort of some interesting and informative thoughts on what environmental sociology is. A textbook by John Hannigan offers a good intro to sort of understanding it as well. And it's in the book Environmental Sociology, third edition, Planets or Planet in Peril, pages 1 to 19, accessible by Google Books to read that. David Schlossberg, like I said, Defining Environmental Justice, Theories, Movements, and Nature, as well as then the Boykoff article, the Walker article, et al., Andrew Saz's work, and then Robert Bullard's Dumping in Dixie. And so expand this back out. And so there's Dumping in Dixie. Really good book. It's pretty short. It's with the references and index, it's only 200 pages. It's very informative, so easy read and I think well worth it. A more sort of contemporary, not want to say pop science, but more popular press, Earth by Bill McKibben is a good book too, that sort of gets at these issues in a little bit different way and expands on that. And then I like to read lots of stuff, and so this one I actually just picked up at a thrift store, Waste and Want, right? The social history of trash. To me, that speaks to my sort of environmental sociologist. What do we do with our trash? Why do we have so much? Thinking of the holiday season where gifts are given, do you reuse your wrapping paper? Do you get new? Or whatever it might be in the packaging. And so what do we do with our trash? It's kind of interesting because, we sell it, we move it from state to state. And so there's lots going on there. So just a few books to think about. And that's really it. So I want to say thank you so much, and I hope this was informative. Bye.